You didn't come across this video by accident. And I know you've heard that before. But this time it's different. Because something is happening to you right now. And you've been feeling it. Maybe you can't fully explain what it is. But something has changed. Things that used to make sense don't anymore. Conversations that used to hold your attention now feel empty. Environments that once felt normal have started to feel off. And the strangest part, it's not sadness. It's not exactly anxiety. And it's not just exhaustion. It's like you're out of place. Like you're living the same life, but with the feeling that something no longer fits. And this starts to show up in small details. You begin to question things you never questioned before. You start noticing patterns in people. You begin to see beyond what is being said. And at the same time, a strange sense of distance appears. As if you're observing everything from the outside. Even yourself. And let me tell you something with absolute clarity. This is not confusion. And it's not a problem either. What you're feeling is the beginning of something. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly what is happening to you. But there's something important here. Because this process doesn't happen to everyone. In fact, most people go their entire lives without ever reaching this level of perception. And that's exactly why it feels so unsettling. Because when it starts, there's no reference, no ready-made explanation, and most importantly, no easy way back. But this still isn't the most important part. Because what you're feeling is not just an emotional shift. It's the beginning of an internal reorganization that, if you understand it the right way, will completely change the way you see reality. And this is where almost everyone gets it wrong. The biggest mistake you can make right now is to think this is just a phase. Because it's not. You're not confused. You're not lost. And you're definitely not strange. What's happening is that you've started to come out of autopilot. And that changes everything. For most of your life, you've been operating within patterns you never consciously chose. Ways of thinking. Ways of reacting. Ways of seeing the world. That were built little by little. Family. Environment. Experiences. Beliefs repeated so many times that they started to feel like truth. And the problem isn't that. The problem begins when you start believing that this is who you are. Because the moment you fully identify with those patterns, you stop questioning. And when you stop questioning, you enter autopilot. You live in the same cycle. You repeat the same reactions. You make decisions based on old versions of yourself, without even realizing it. And on the outside, everything looks normal. But on the inside, there is a limit. And when that limit starts to be crossed, the feeling appears. That strangeness. That disconnection. That sense that something no longer fits. Not because reality has changed, but because you've started to see beyond it. And that's uncomfortable. Because everything that once felt solid starts to lose its stability. Certainties stop feeling so certain. Answers stop being enough. And your own identity starts to become unstable. And this is exactly where most people get stuck. Because this moment requires a silent choice. Either you go back to autopilot and try to ignore what you're feeling, or you keep going, even without fully understanding. And what almost no one realizes is that this feeling is not the problem. It's the signal. A signal that something inside you has started to move. But understanding this still isn't enough. Because there's something deeper happening behind all of this. And when you understand this next level, you begin to see reality in a way you've never seen before. What's happening to you is not just an emotional change. It's a shift in perception. And that is much deeper than it seems. Because the way you see reality is not reality itself. It's a filter. A filter built by your mind. based on everything you've lived, learned, and repeated. And for a long time, that filter operated without being questioned. You saw the world in a certain way, and believed that was the world. But now, something has started to change in that filter. And when the filter changes, reality seems to change with it. But not because the external world has transformed. Instead, because you've started to see from a different level. It's like for a long time, you were looking through a lens. And suddenly, that lens begins to dissolve. And at first, this doesn't bring clarity. It brings strangeness. Because you don't yet have a stable new way of seeing. But you can no longer go back to the old one. And that's exactly what creates this feeling you've been experiencing. That mixture of clarity and discomfort, of perception and doubt. Because one part of you has started to wake up, but another part is still attached to the old pattern. And that creates a kind of internal conflict that almost no one knows how to name. You begin to notice things that once went unnoticed. You start seeing inconsistencies, repetitive patterns, automatic behaviors, both in others and in yourself. And this completely changes the way you relate to the world. Because what once felt normal now feels mechanical. What once made sense now feels superficial. And this can create a sense of distance. But in reality, it's the beginning of a connection with something deeper. Because when perception expands, you stop reacting automatically and start observing. And that point is one of the most important in this entire process. Because the moment you begin to observe, without being completely carried away by your thoughts, is the moment something new opens. A space between you and what is happening inside your mind. And it is within this space that real change begins. But this is exactly where most people get lost. Because this space can feel empty. It can feel confusing. It can even feel uncomfortable. And without understanding what's happening, many people try to fill that space quickly. They go back to distractions, to old patterns, to familiar versions of themselves, just to avoid dealing with this new perception. But what almost no one realizes is that this space is not a mistake. It's the key. Because it is within it that you begin, for the first time, to not be completely controlled by your patterns. And this explains a lot. But it still doesn't explain everything. Because there is a specific reason why this creates so much discomfort. And when you understand that, everything starts to make even more sense. There is a very clear reason why this creates so much discomfort. And it's not spiritual. It's structural. Your brain was programmed to maintain stability. It wasn't designed to seek truth. It was designed to keep you safe. And for it, safety means predictability. It means repeating what is already known, thinking the way you've always thought, reacting the way you've always reacted. Because all of that creates a sense of control. Now, when your perception starts to change, it breaks that pattern, and your brain interprets that as a threat, even if nothing is actually wrong. That's why the discomfort appears. That's why doubt shows up. That's why that feeling of instability emerges. Because in practice, you are stepping out of an automatic pattern that has been reinforced for years. And there's an even deeper layer to this. Your identity, what you call you, is not something fixed. It's a construction. A set of thoughts, memories, and patterns that you've repeated so many times that you started to believe that's who you are. And the ego exists precisely to protect that construction. It tries to keep everything as it is. Even if that means repeating cycles, maintaining habits, or staying in situations that no longer make sense. Because for it, the familiar is more comfortable than the unknown. Now you understand why this feels so heavy. Because when you start to see beyond, it's not just the world that changes. It's you. And that activates an almost automatic internal resistance. One part of you wants to keep going, wants to understand, wants to move forward. But another part wants to go back, wants to simplify. wants to pretend nothing is happening. And it's exactly this division that creates this silent conflict. But here is the most important point of all. This conflict does not mean you are on the wrong path. It means you have started to access a level of consciousness that clashes with your old patterns. Psychology calls this internal dissonance. Neuroscience calls it a pattern break. But in practice, it is the moment when your mind begins to reorganize itself. And reorganizing the mind means reorganizing the way you perceive everything. Situations, people, decisions, even your own past. And that's why this isn't light. But it's not random either. There is a process happening. And when you understand this, you stop resisting. But this still isn't the deepest part. Because there is something beyond the mind, quietly influencing all of this. And this is where the process stops being only psychological and starts touching something even greater. Up to this point, you've understood what's happening in your mind. But that's only part of it. Because there is something deeper influencing all of this. Your internal state. And when I say internal state, I'm not just talking about thoughts. I'm talking about something more subtle. The way you feel. The way you perceive. The way you position yourself internally. In relation to reality. All of this creates a pattern. And that pattern functions like a kind of frequency. Not in a superficial mystical sense, but as a continuous state that organizes how you interpret everything. And this changes the entire game. Because the reality you experience is not just what happens outside. It's what you are able to perceive, interpret, and respond to. And when your internal state changes, those three things change together. You begin to notice things you didn't notice before. You start interpreting situations in a different way. And most importantly, you begin to react differently. And in practice, this completely alters the kind of experience you have. The same situation can generate two completely different realities, depending on the internal state of the person experiencing it. And that's why, when this shift begins within you, it feels like the world around you is changing too. But it's not the world that changed. It's your level of perception. And this has deep consequences. Because little by little, things that once made sense start to lose meaning. People who once matched your energy begin to drift away. Environments that once felt normal start to feel misaligned. And this can feel like loss. But in reality, it's an adjustment, a realignment. Because when your internal state changes, everything that is not in resonance with that new state starts to lose strength. And this happens naturally, without forced effort, without dramatic decisions. It simply no longer fits. And this is exactly where many people get scared. Because it feels like everything is falling apart. But what's actually happening is the opposite. You are beginning to step out of a version of yourself that no longer represents you. And this doesn't just affect what's outside. It also affects how you see yourself. Your identity begins to expand. And what once defined you is no longer enough. And this creates a space where new possibilities begin to emerge. New ways of thinking. New ways of acting. New ways of being. But there is something important here. This process is not comfortable, because it requires you to sustain a state that is not yet fully stable. It's like crossing a bridge between who you were and who you are becoming. And in the middle of that crossing, there isn't much clarity. There is sensation. There is intuition. There is perception. But there is not yet a solid structure. And that's why so many people go back. Because it's easier to return to what is known than to sustain the unknown. But what almost no one realizes is that this discomfort is not a mistake. It is the transition itself. And if you move through it consciously, something begins to happen. You stop reacting to reality and begin, little by little, to influence how it organizes itself around you. But this still hasn't reached the most important point. Because all of this still doesn't fully explain why this started now. And when you understand that, the feeling you had at the beginning of this video takes on a completely new meaning. If you look honestly, this didn't start out of nowhere. Before this feeling appeared, there were already signs, small discomforts, thoughts you ignored, moments when something felt off. But you kept going. You distracted yourself. You adapted. You adjusted to what was expected. And little by little, you drifted away from yourself, without realizing it. This happens to almost everyone, because there is a very strong tendency to shape yourself to the environment, to fit in, to correspond, even if, for that, you have to ignore parts of yourself. But there comes a point when this starts to have a cost. And the cost doesn't show up in an obvious way. It shows up as a feeling, as emptiness, as disconnection, as that strange impression that you're living on autopilot. And when this intensifies, your mind tries to explain it. It tries to rationalize. It tries to find a simple reason. But it can't. Because what's happening is not logical. It's internal. And more than that, it's accumulated. It's the result of everything you avoided looking at. Everything you avoided feeling. Everything you kept postponing within yourself. And now, it has started to emerge. Not as a problem, but as a call. A call for you to return. To return to perceiving. To return to feeling. To return to observing yourself with presence. But there is a delicate point here. Because this return requires you to see things you may have avoided for a long time. Patterns that keep repeating. Choices that weren't conscious. Behaviors that don't reflect who you truly are. And this can be uncomfortable. It can create resistance. It can create denial. Because it directly touches your identity. And no one likes to realize they are not being fully true to themselves. But at the same time, this is exactly what sets you free. Because the moment you begin to see this clearly, you stop confusing yourself with those patterns. You stop believing, this is just who I am. And you begin to realize that this is just what has been repeated. And this is one of the most important points in this entire process. Because when you separate who you are from what you learn to be, a space opens. And within that space, there is choice. You begin to see that you can respond differently. That you can think differently. That you can act differently. And that changes everything. But there is one detail almost no one talks about. This moment of clarity does not come with certainty. It comes with uncertainty. Because you don't yet have a new identity fully formed. But you can no longer sustain the old one. And this creates a kind of emptiness. An emptiness that is not absence. It is transition. But without understanding this, many people try to fill that emptiness too quickly. With distraction. With impulsive decisions. Or by going back to old patterns. Just to avoid dealing with this feeling. But if you sustain that space, even for a few moments, something begins to reorganize. And that reorganization is the true beginning of transformation. But there is still one point that completes all of this. Because up to now, you've understood what is happening. Now you need to understand what changes from here. From the moment you begin to sustain this new perception, something changes. Not instantly. Not like a magical switch. But progressively. Subtle at first. Deep over time. Because you begin to step out of an automatic pattern and enter a more conscious state. And that affects everything. Your decisions stop being impulsive and become clearer. You begin to perceive before reacting. You start choosing instead of simply repeating. And that alone already changes your entire experience. Situations that used to destabilize you begin to lose their power. People who used to influence your emotions no longer have the same effect. Environments that used to pull you down lose that control. Not because the world has changed, but because you've changed how you position yourself within it. And this creates a kind of freedom that doesn't depend on anything external. But there is something even more interesting happening here. When you change the way you perceive, you also change the way you respond. And when your response changes, the results begin to change. The situations you attract, the choices you make, the opportunities you notice, everything begins to reorganize. And this may seem like coincidence, but it's not. It's consequence. A consequence of a new internal state that begins to stabilize. And the more you sustain that state, the more this intensifies. You begin to feel more clarity, more presence, more direction. Not because someone told you what to do, but because you begin to perceive with more precision. And this brings a different feeling. A feeling of alignment. As if, for the first time, you are living from the inside out, instead of reacting from the outside in. But there is an essential point here. Knowing this is not enough. Because understanding the process does not mean applying it. And that is exactly why many people stop at this stage. They understand. They feel. But they don't sustain it. And without consistency, the tendency is to go back. Back to old patterns. To automatic thoughts. To the previous identity. And that's why the next step is the most important of all. Because there is a way to turn this into something practical. Something you can apply. Even if you don't have everything fully clear yet. And when you begin to do that, this shift stops being just a feeling and starts becoming a new way of living. Now, this is where everything starts to become real. Because up to this point, you've understood. But now you need to live it. And the simplest way to begin is through something almost no one truly practices. Conscious observation. Without trying to change anything. Without trying to control. Just observe. Throughout your day. In small moments. Pause for a few seconds. And notice. What is happening in your mind right now? Without judgment. Without trying to fix it. Just see it. Notice the pattern. Notice the repetition. Notice the tone of your thoughts. Because most of the time, you're not thinking. You're being thought. These are automatic patterns. Running without your awareness. Now, when you observe this, something happens. You create separation. A space between you and what is happening inside your mind. And that space is where everything changes. Because within it, you are no longer the pattern. You are the one who sees the pattern. And that gives you a kind of freedom you've never had before. But there is a second step. When you notice that you've entered an automatic pattern, don't fight it. Don't try to force a change. Just do this. Breathe. Breathe consciously. Inhale through your nose. Hold for a few seconds. Exhale slowly through your mouth. And as you do this, bring your attention back. As if you were returning to yourself. And in that moment, introduce direction. A simple phrase. Clear. Intentional. Something like, I choose awareness. Or, I am not this pattern. Or even, I return to center. It's not about believing. It's about directing. Because every time you do this, you begin to weaken the automatic and strengthen presence. And over time, this stops being effort and starts becoming natural. And before we continue, do this now. Write in the comments, I choose to see beyond the illusion. It's not just interaction. It's reinforcement. When you write it, you anchor this in a different way within yourself. And the more you repeat it, the more it begins to become part of how you think. But there is a third point that almost no one is willing to face. Because observing, and even directing, is just the beginning. But sustaining this in real life requires something more. And that is exactly what determines whether this will be just a moment or the true beginning of a transformation. If you've made it this far, something has already changed. Even if you can't fully explain what, you are no longer at the same point. Because the moment you begin to perceive, you can no longer stop seeing. You can ignore it for a while. You can try to go back to autopilot. You can even pretend nothing happened. But deep down, you know there is something beyond the way you used to live. You know that what once felt normal no longer feels enough. And that changes everything. Because now, you are no longer just someone reacting to reality. You are someone who is beginning to see how that reality is being constructed within you. And that creates a break. A separation between who you were and who you are becoming. And that separation is not external. It is internal. You begin to see yourself from the outside. You begin to notice your own patterns. You begin to question your own reactions. And that level of awareness does not disappear. It may fluctuate. It may feel stronger at times, weaker at others. But it does not go back to zero. Because something has already been activated. And when that happens, a new identity begins to emerge. Not as something you force, but as something you recognize. You begin to identify less with patterns, and more with the awareness that observes. Less with autopilot, and more with presence. And that changes how you position yourself in the world. You stop looking for answers outside, and begin to perceive within. You stop reacting immediately, and begin to choose. You stop repeating, and begin to create. And this doesn't happen overnight. But it happens. And the more you sustain this awareness, the more this new identity strengthens. Until there comes a point where going back to the old version no longer makes sense. Because it no longer represents you. And this is exactly where the process becomes irreversible. Not because you know more, but because you see differently. And when you see differently, you live differently. And when you live differently, your entire reality begins to follow that shift. And that's why, if you truly felt what was said here, you are no longer the same. If what you felt here was real for you, then don't let this pass as just another video. Go to the comments right now and write, "I am no longer the same. This isn't for me." It's for you to mark the moment when something started to change. Because when you recognize it, you strengthen it. And there's one more thing. There is someone close to you who is starting to feel this, but still doesn't understand it. Send this video to that person. Sometimes, all someone needs is a single message at the right moment. And if any part of this made sense to you, leave a signal here. Because the more this kind of content circulates, the fewer people remain stuck on autopilot. Now pay attention to this. Because feeling this is just the beginning. What you are experiencing is not just an emotional shift. It is the beginning of an internal reorganization. But here is what almost no one realizes. Feeling is not enough. Because without clarity, this perception starts to fade. You go back to the same patterns, the same doubts, the same confusion. And that's exactly why so many people get stuck at this point. And that's exactly why I organized all of this into a direct material. No excess. No unnecessary complexity. Only what truly matters for you to understand. How your mind works. How these patterns control you. And how to step out of them in a practical way. The name is Unlocking the Hidden Power of Consciousness. If you want to stop just feeling and start truly understanding, the link is in the pinned comment. But only go there if you are truly ready to step out of the same level of consciousness. Now, there's one more thing you need to understand. Because what you felt here is not new. This has been described a long time ago, but in a way that almost no one has interpreted correctly. And maybe you've come across this before, but couldn't connect everything. And this is exactly where something important comes in. There is a video here on the channel where I explain, in a much deeper way, how this process really works. Not just what you feel, but the mechanism behind it. How your mind reorganizes perception. How this changes the way you interpret reality. And why this begins to impact your timeline itself. And when you see this clearly, everything starts to click. The feeling stops being confusing and starts to make sense. So do this. Go to the video that's appearing on your screen right now. It's not the next step. It's the missing explanation. But only enter if you truly want to understand what has begun inside you.